A 30-year-old man sits in his office at Apple headquarters in Cupertino, California. He just got fired. Not from some random company, from the company he founded. The company he built from scratch in his parents' garage. Apple Computer. The board of directors voted him out. His own hand-picked CEO, John Sculley, orchestrated the removal. Steve Jobs, the face of Apple, the visionary who introduced the Macintosh to the world, is being forced out. He is devastated, humiliated, lost. For months, he considers leaving Silicon Valley entirely. Maybe starting over somewhere else. Maybe giving up on technology altogether. But something shifts inside his brain. Instead of seeing this as the end, he reframes it as freedom. And that psychological shift, that ability to reframe catastrophic failure into opportunity, is what separates Steve Jobs from almost everyone else. Getting fired did not destroy him. It rebuilt him into the person who would later create the iPhone, the iPad, and turn Apple into the most valuable company on earth. Steve Jobs was born in 1955 in San Francisco and adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs. His adoptive father was a mechanic who taught Steve how to build things with his hands. Steve grew up in the early days of Silicon Valley, a place exploding with innovation. He was curious, rebellious, and obsessed with design. He dropped out of Reed College after one semester because he did not see the point of paying for classes that did not interest him. But he did not leave campus. He stayed and audited classes he found fascinating, including a calligraphy course. That course taught him about typography, fonts, and visual beauty. Years later, he would say that calligraphy class was one of the most important things he ever did, because it shaped his obsession with making computers not just functional, but beautiful. In 1976, Steve co-founded Apple with Steve Wozniak in his parents' garage. Wozniak was the engineering genius. Jobs was the visionary who understood what people wanted before they knew they wanted it. They built the Apple I, then the Apple II, which became a massive success. By 1980, Apple went public, and Steve Jobs became a multimillionaire at age 25. He was on the cover of magazines. He was famous. He was untouchable. But success at a young age can be dangerous. It inflates the ego. It makes you believe you are always right. And that is exactly what happened to Steve. He became difficult to work with, controlling, obsessive. He believed his vision was the only vision that mattered. In 1984, Apple released the Macintosh. It was a beautiful, revolutionary computer, but it was also expensive and underpowered. Sales were disappointing. The board started questioning Steve's leadership. Steve had recruited John Sculley, a successful executive from Pepsi, to be Apple's CEO. He famously asked Sculley, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Sculley joined. But soon the two clashed. Steve wanted to keep pushing radical innovation. Sculley wanted to focus on profitability and stability. The board sided with Sculley. In 1985, Steve was removed from all operational roles. He was kicked out of his own company. For most people, this would be the end. The ultimate failure. Public humiliation. Loss of identity. Steve later said it was like being punched in the stomach and having the wind knocked out of him for months. But here is where his psychology becomes fascinating. Most people, when they fail publicly, internalize it. They think, "I failed, therefore I am a failure." Their identity collapses. Steve did something different. He separated the event from his identity. He did not think, "I am a failure." He thought, "This situation failed, but I am still capable of creating something great." Psychologists call this cognitive reframing. It is the ability to take a negative event and deliberately change its meaning. Instead of, "I got fired, my life is over," the reframed version is, "I got fired. Now I am free to start over without constraints." That shift in interpretation changes everything. It turns a psychological catastrophe into a psychological opportunity. Steve said in a famous Stanford commencement speech years later, "Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me." The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, free to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. That statement is not just poetic. It is a precise description of a psychological transformation. When you are successful, you become risk-averse. You have something to protect. You play it safe. When you lose everything, you have nothing to protect. You can take risks again. After leaving Apple, Steve founded a new computer company called Next. It was supposed to revolutionize education and high-end computing. The computers were beautiful, cutting edge, but also too expensive. Next never became a commercial success. Most people would see this as a second failure. But Steve did not. He saw it as an experiment. He was learning. At the same time, he bought a small animation studio from George Lucas for $5 million. That studio was called Pixar. At first, Pixar was just making computer graphics hardware and short films. Steve poured money into it, even when it was losing millions. Everyone thought he was wasting his money. But Steve believed in the people at Pixar. He believed in their creative vision. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film. It was a massive success. Pixar went public, and Steve's stake became worth over $1 billion. Suddenly, the man who had been fired from Apple was a billionaire again. Not because of computers, but because of animated movies. Here's the psychology at work. Steve did not cling to his old identity as the guy who builds computers. He allowed his identity to evolve. Most people have rigid identities. They think, I am a teacher, or I am an engineer, and when that role is taken away, they collapse. Steve's identity was more fluid. He thought of himself as a creator, a builder, someone who made great things. It did not matter if it was computers or movies. That flexibility allowed him to pivot without losing his sense of self. Meanwhile, Apple was struggling. Without Steve, the company lost its direction. It released mediocre products. It lost market share. By the mid-1990s, Apple was close to bankruptcy. In 1996, Apple bought Next for over $400 million, primarily to get its operating system. And as part of the deal, Steve Jobs returned to Apple. Not as CEO at first, but as an advisor. Within a year, he maneuvered himself back into the CEO role. Now here's where the psychological transformation becomes clear. The Steve Jobs who returned to Apple in 1997 was not the same Steve Jobs who was fired in 1985. The old Steve was arrogant, controlling, and believed he was always right. The new Steve was still demanding and obsessive, but he had learned humility. He had learned to listen. He had learned to focus. When he returned, he immediately cut 70% of Apple's product line. He said, "We are going to focus on making a few things insanely great instead of 100 things that are okay." That focus came from his time in the wilderness. He had learned that trying to do everything dilutes your energy. Mastery comes from elimination. The new Steve also understood collaboration. At Pixar, he had worked with creative geniuses like John Lasseter and Ed Catmull. He learned that great things come from teams, not lone geniuses. He applied that lesson at Apple, building teams that could execute his vision. In 1998, Apple released the iMac. It was colorful, simple, and elegant. It was a hit. Then came the iPod in 2001, a device that put 1,000 songs in your pocket. Then the iPhone in 2007, which redefined what a phone could be. Then the iPad in 2010. Each product was not just a technical achievement. It was a psychological achievement. Steve understood human desire. He understood that people do not just want functionality. They want beauty. They want simplicity. They want to feel something when they use a product. That insight came from his years of studying design, typography, calligraphy, and even Zen Buddhism. He had a holistic view of technology as art. And that view was only possible because he had been forced out of Apple and spent a decade exploring other fields. There's another layer to his psychology, his relationship with mortality. In 2003, Steve was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He initially tried to treat it with alternative medicine, which delayed proper treatment. Eventually, he had surgery. The cancer returned. He knew he was dying. That knowledge changed him. He became even more focused. He said in his Stanford speech, "Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life." Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. That is ego death in the literal sense. When you know you are going to die, your ego, your need for approval, your fear of judgment, all of it becomes irrelevant. You focus only on what matters. For Steve, that was creating products that would outlive him. The firing in 1985 was a psychological ego death in a different sense. It destroyed his identity as the untouchable founder of Apple. It forced him to confront failure, rejection, and irrelevance. Most people never recover from that. But Steve did not just recover. He used it as fuel. He rebuilt himself from scratch. He experimented with Next. He took a risk on Pixar. He learned from his mistakes. And when he returned to Apple, he was no longer the young, arrogant founder. He was a mature, focused, relentless creator. That version of Steve Jobs built the iPhone. That version changed the world. The old Steve, the one who never got fired, would never have created the iPhone. He would have been too attached to past success, too afraid to take risks, too rigid in his thinking. Getting fired shattered that rigidity. So what can an ordinary person learn from Steve Jobs' psychology? First, practice cognitive reframing. When something terrible happens, resist the urge to collapse into "I am a failure." Instead, ask, what does this make possible? A job loss might force you to explore a field you would never have considered. A breakup might free you to become the person you were meant to be. Reframing does not deny the pain. It redirects the energy. Second, separate your identity from your role. You are not your job title. You are not your company. You are a person with skills, creativity, and adaptability. When one role ends, you can build another. Third, embrace beginner's mind. When you lose status or success, you lose the weight of expectations. Use that freedom to experiment. Try things you would have been too afraid to try when you had something to protect. Fourth, let failure teach you. Steve learned focus from Next's struggles. He learned collaboration from Pixar. He learned humility from being fired. Every failure became data. Finally, remember mortality. You will die. Everyone you know will die. That fact should not depress you. It should liberate you. It should make you focus only on what truly matters and ignore the rest. Steve Jobs died in 2011 at age 56. By then, Apple was the most valuable company in the world. The iPhone had become the most successful product in history. Pixar had created some of the greatest animated films ever made. His legacy was secure. But none of that would have happened if he had not been fired in 1985. That firing was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his transformation. It forced him to confront his ego, rebuild his identity, and discover what he was truly capable of. His psychology, his ability to reframe catastrophe as opportunity, to separate identity from outcome, to embrace beginner's mind, is what made him a genius. Not his intelligence, not his technical skills, his psychology. And that is something anyone can learn.